We previously looked at moving the job acceptance curve and thought about policies the government could implement which would first increase the prevailing level of unemployment by moving job acceptance to the left, and then reduce unemployment by moving job acceptance to the right. Now let's just relabel this as our prevailing level of unemployment. Now we're going to think about alternative policies, and we can think about a different approach to unemployment, which might be to move the labour force curve. So if we think about the impact that's been relatively controversial, the impact of the European Union on the UK since 2008, then being a member of a customs union with a free market and free movement of labour, essentially what you've done is move the labour force to the right. This is great in terms of increasing the resources which are available to an economy. And if we look at the UK, the rates of inward migration have been very significant, and yet the UK retains an extremely low level of unemployment. So the workers that were coming into the UK from the rest of the European Union were hugely beneficial to the rate of growth. So essentially migration meant that the labour force curve was shifted to the right. What this means for employers is that we can have we don't need to shift the demand for labour curve. We can have a higher rate of employment. We can move from 1 to 2 because essentially we're seeing a slight reduction in the real wage. The impact this has on the competition prevents workers from successfully negotiating for pay rises with their employers, because there are always alternative workers. And we can see this if we look at the prevailing rate of wage increases since the financial crisis. We've had an inward flow of workers, very high level of employment and very low levels of wage growth. So the labour force can be shifted in this way. Conversely, the government can introduce policies which reduce the labour force. So this is labour force 1, and this will be our labour force 2. It's very easy in the current context to think of ways that you can reduce your labour force. So moving into a Brexit period when the UK begins to tighten opportunities for migration for workers from the European Union, we're likely to see a significant shift in the labour force in this direction. So if we don't anticipate a change in the demand for labour, essentially total employment will be lower, but if we have no change in our job acceptance, then essentially unemployment will reduce, the gap between here and here is reduced, and we should see a slightly higher prevailing real wage, because the tightening of the labour market, the fact that there are fewer applicants for each vacancy in the UK, should enable workers to negotiate for wage increases. So in that sense, it could be beneficial to the workers who remain in the UK with the right to work. So we've looked at, this is video X+1, we've looked at moving the job acceptance curve, we've looked at moving the labour force supply curve, so we've looked at expanding and reducing these, but obviously in addition to these movements we can also affect the prevailing level of unemployment through working on the demand side. So movements in the labour force, we could argue, and movements in the job acceptance curve are to do with supply-side policies. Supply-side policies which impact on the labour market. But impacting directly the demand for labour are clearly demand-side policies. So let's think first about what happens to unemployment if we stimulate and increase the demand for labour. So here was our original rate of unemployment, the difference between the capacity, the total capacity in the economy, and the demand for labour intersecting with the supply of labour. So that was unemployment. Now we see a demand side policy which increases employers' demand for labour. So we call that demand for labour dash or demand for labour 1. Immediately we see we're going to end up with a slightly higher prevailing wage, and we're going to see a reduction in unemployment. So unemployment moves from 1 to 2 to 3 to 2. So in terms of how a government could negotiate this, we can think of policies which would relate to demand from the government. So if we think about the role of merit in public goods, the government directly and indirectly is a very significant employer. It employs people through education at primary, secondary and further education levels. It employs people in the National Health Service. It employs people in civil service, the army, the police, prison service. So if the government decided to increase direct government spending on public and merit goods, this would feed through into higher levels of employment by the government, which would increase the demand for labour. Conversely, we might be in a scenario such as we've been in since 2010, when a government decides to reduce spending on public and merit goods. So here we have demand for labour 2, which we might associate with austerity policies. So since 2010, the UK government has concentrated on reducing the value of the annual deficit and the value of national debt, which has required it to reduce its spending on public and merit goods. So we've seen job cuts in the police, in prisons, we've seen effective freezes in health service and in schools, and we've seen very significant reductions in government servants, whether civil servants working for the national or for local governments. So if the demand for labour from the government in the role of employer reduces, we see the demand for labour shift down. Essentially, this means that competition for fewer vacancies will encourage a lower value of the real wage. So the prevailing wage in the economy will be reduced, but essentially what we'll see is an increase in unemployment. So if our initial level of unemployment was, actually it needs to be drawn there, the green line is so faint I can't see it. So if our initial level of unemployment was between 1 and 2, our new level of unemployment will be between 0.2, the capacity available given the size of the labour force, and 0.4, the low level of employment resulting from government austerity policies. So this results in an increase in unemployment. Now the last remaining thing to do is just to reflect once again on economically active people and economically inactive people. So you might think that active people are just people in employment, but it's not. It's the employed and the unemployed, because the unemployed, in order to be categorised as unemployed using the International Labour Organization Labour Force Survey definition, have to be seeking work. They have to be actively, regularly looking. So economically active people are the employed and the unemployed. Economically inactive would be the sick and disabled, who are too unwell to work. We'd also have early retirees, people who are rich enough to give up work early. Of course, we have students, some of whom don't need to work even on a part-time basis. And the key concept and the influential group when we think about the economically inactive, and our ability to reduce the size of that group is to look at discouraged workers. The discouraged workers are people who originally were unemployed and they lost faith or lost hope in finding an opportunity over time. And if you remember the lecture on unemployment, then an additional concept which we associated with the discouraged workers was the concept of hysteresis, which is the deterioration in the work ethic and in the skills of people as they move into long-term unemployment. So long-term unemployment, 12 months plus out of work, then we're likely to see hysteresis. These people become unattractive to employers. And because they're unattractive, they don't help to keep the prevailing wage level low. If they don't represent a good alternative source of labour to the employer, then the employer might be compelled to give wage rises to those who have jobs. And that concludes our analysis of unemployment.